All right. Well, hey, everybody who's made it here so far. I'm Reuben. I'm glad to have you here. We're going to give it probably another 2 or 3 minutes and let people roll in, and then we'll get started. So hang tight, and we'll get started just in a minute here. All righty. Well, I think we're going to let the stragglers come in and catch up as they enter. So, welcome everybody. My name is Reuben Cash. I'm the environmental coordinator for Skagway Traditional Council. Thanks for joining us this evening. I have my contact information listed here on the splash screen. So if the information presented tonight sparks any sort of interest, please feel free to get in touch with me. Be forewarned, I love this stuff and I can go on for ages. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording this event, so if you're uncomfortable with your face appearing online, you can switch off your camera. If you've ever been on Zoom, you've probably experienced the funky audio that occurs when multiple people are talking or when background noise overtakes the main speaker. So in order to keep things running smoothly, we'll be keeping everyone muted for the first portion of the talk. If you do have a question during my monologue, feel free to type it into the chat. I'll do my best to address it, but we'll have a formal question and answer period at the end. So hang tight if I don't get to your inquiry right away. The Q&A session will work something like this. Those of you who would like to ask a question verbally, you can type your name into the chat and then I'll call your name and you can unmute yourself and ask away. There's different ways to unmute yourself depending on what platform or device you're using. So I think on an iPad or on an Android device, you just tap on the screen and look for the little microphone button. You should be able to mute and unmute yourself there. If you would rather not speak, you can simply type the question into the chat. I will read it and respond. I wasn't sure how many folks we'd have on this call tonight, so I was anticipating or preparing myself for having a large group. Since this is more of a small group, I think it will be much more informal as far as question and answer goes. We're still getting accustomed to holding these events online, so bear with us if things are a little bit disheveled. We got a lot to cover tonight, and I always find that it's good to have a bit of a roadmap. Right. The first healthy portion of my talk will offer you some background information on general air quality concepts that hopefully will be helpful in understanding the results of our study. Don't worry, the quiz at the end is only a few dozen questions and it will be graded on a curve. I'm totally kidding, there's no quiz. So first we're going to start out by taking this large 10,000 foot view of air pollution, how it's defined and categorized. And then we're going to move into an overview of specific category of air pollution, PM 2.5, what its health effects are, some of its major sources, and then we'll move on to cover federal regulations and a description of how we can measure it. This will set you up to understand our study design and arm you with the information to interpret the results from our study this last summer. And then I'll follow up with some of my thoughts for the future, and we can jump into the Q&A session. That sound good to everybody? Cool. All right. So Skagway Traditional Council's Environmental Department develops programs to address priority issues identified through tribal member input, strategic planning meetings, tribal council oversight, and discussions between staff. So air quality was determined to be a top environmental concern for tribal members, and for good reason. I think we can all recognize that potential sources of air pollution in Skagway greatly increased during the busy summer months. But first, I think we need to talk about what constitutes air pollution. So air pollution is basically a general term describing particles of various compounds that are released into the air and are detrimental to human health and ecological systems. According to the World Health Organization, outdoor air pollution was associated with 4.2 million premature deaths in 2018, primarily through the inhalation of ultrafine particles, or particulate matter, that enter the bloodstream through the lungs and can cause cardiovascular and respiratory distress. We define these particles in terms of their size, using very small increments known as micrometers or microns. So in the scientific field, we use the International System of Units for ease of comparing data between countries that may formally use incompatible units of measurements, like centimeters in Canada, inches in the United States. So we could go over the incredibly exciting process of conversion, but I'm guessing that very few of you brought your graphing calculators or a strong desire for math at 7 o'clock in the evening. So I find that this graphic is very useful in visualizing what we're talking about. I think we can all picture a grain of sand in terms of size, right? It's small, but it's tangible. It's around 90 microns in diameter. A human hair is also recognizable to the naked eye, measures between 50 and 70 microns. So when you're driving along the Dyea Road, right, and you're behind a DOT truck or a coach bus or another car, the cloud of debris that's kicked up by the lead vehicle's tires, typically dust particles that are less than 10 microns in diameter. Pollen grains from spruce and pine trees and mold spores, these are all roughly the same size. So in this graphic, these little blue spheres here, just so you get a size comparison to something that is tangible. It's very, very small. We call the individual particles of matter this size quite appropriately particulate matter 10 or PM10. These are inhalable particles, and they can certainly cause some health problems by getting lodged in your lungs and initiating inflammation. Therefore, PM10 is the largest size of air pollution regulated by federal agencies. Far more dangerous to human health, however, are particles less than 2.5 microns. And superimposed over this little blue dot here, you can see these 4 little purpley red dots. That's 2.5 microns. These are not only inhalable, but they can enter the bloodstream. They can be composed of a number of different chemicals, and they can travel incredible distances from their source because they're so small. They're allowed to stay aloft in the air column for longer, so they can travel these incredible distances. Concentrations of fine particle pollutants, or PM2.5, are one of the main factors used when you're determining an air quality index. So scientists have been studying the relationship between particulate matter and human health for a long, long time, decades and decades. For example, Singh et al. From the Department of Respiratory Medicine at Tsinghua University in China reported that for every 10 microgram increase in PM2.5, don't worry, that's an ambiguous number for now, but I'll explain it in a bit. So for that every 10 microgram increase in PM2.5, hospitalization rates accelerated by 8%, lifespan decreased by 0.35 years, mortality from cardiopulmonary disease and certain cancers increased by 4 to 8%, and mortality from lung cancer specifically increased 15 to 27%. If you look at this graph here on the upper right, what we're looking at is the result from surveys in several Chinese cities, which revealed this definite linear correlation between death and PM2.5. So on the horizontal axis here, you have PM2.5 concentrations going from left to right, we're increasing, and you notice that there is this simultaneous increase in lung death. That's that correlation. And if you look at this graph in the bottom here, it's pretty much this one in the top right that I'm talking about. Lab studies in this paper showed that lung infection rates in PM2.5 exposed mice increased 4-fold in 24 hours and 35-fold in 48 hours. The tiny surface of fine particulate matter can additionally initiate a chemical phenomenon known as free radical production. Metals adhered to the surface, such as iron, copper, zinc, manganese. These consume antioxidant compounds, and often the chemical reactions of water-soluble particles produce hydroxyl radicals, which can damage DNA and lead to irreversible damage. Calcium balance in the human body is affected by the presence of these free radicals as well, resulting in decreased cell function, increased cell damage, and accentuated inflammatory response. The EPA list of health effects from exposure to high concentrations of PM2.5 includes non-fatal cardiac arrest, increased severity of asthma, irregular function of the heart and lungs, and premature death in people with pre-existing heart or lung conditions. Environmentally, the most obvious effect of PM2.5 is haze, but it can also cause ecosystem damage depending on what that particulate matter is composed of. Lakes and streams could become more acidic. The nutrient balance of surface water and soils become altered. Canopies of forests and agricultural crops can become damaged. And all of this can severely change species diversity, nutrient pathways, and the general healthy function of a given system. So given the dire consequences of exposure to high levels of particulate matter 2.5 microns and lower, we should probably look at potential sources of these fine particles. So here's a trick. When you think of PM2.5, your brain should scream the word combustion, since this is the primary source. In Skagway, the most obvious potential source is from cruise ships. According to the McDowell Group, Skagway hosted around 450 ships in 2019 and was expected to see a comparable number in 2020. These huge floating cities require a considerable amount of energy produced through burning diesel fuel in their engines. And Alaska Public Media estimates that a single ship uses more electricity than Skagway and Haines combined. With up to 5 ships in port on a single day, that adds up to a lot of exhaust. So what else do we have in Skagway? We have a lot of train and coach bus traffic in the summer. It keeps people moving, helps us avoid total gridlock on Broadway, but those trains and coaches are burning fuel. and combustion equals PM 2.5. What about the population increase that occurs between April and October? We triple our base. Many of these seasonal workers in Skagway bring a car. Summertime traffic in Skagway is definitely higher than that in the winter. And people are also producing more solid waste. Our garbage, our solid waste stream ends at the incinerator, more combustion. Wildfires, this is a new normal across the planet. And my first summer in 2019 showed me that Skagway was certainly not impervious to the effects of smoke from both local and regional fires. This stuff can travel very long ways. And finally, a hidden and technically complex phenomenon occurs in the upper atmosphere as gases like sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides from industrial activities interact chemically, and they produce these secondary particles, which again, they're small, they stay aloft, and they can travel incredible distances and negatively affect air quality from afar. So even though we don't have major industries in Southeast Alaska, as occurs outside the state, we're not immune to the effects of these activities. So we've established that air quality is an important local issue. We've identified the most important category of air pollution in terms of human health and what its effects are on the body. Touched on potential sources here in Skagway. So let's talk about what regulating agencies have determined healthy air to be. In 1970, the Environmental Protection Agency, who has funded this project, established the Clean Air Act, which is a body of legislation created to protect public health through the regulation of air pollution sources. Through the Clean Air Act, practical health limits for PM10 and smaller have been established and serve as benchmarks when we're conducting monitoring and reporting on air quality. These benchmarks are stated as two different metrics, an annual average and a 24-hour average. And these are evaluated by measuring the gravimetric weight, it's a fancy word for weight, of particulate matter in a cubic meter of air. And this makes sense. We breathe in a certain volume of air, and the weight of the particulate matter in that airspace represents its concentration. For PM 2.5, we measure in micrograms, and these are exactly what they sound like. They're teeny tiny little grams. Not to be confused with these teeny tiny little grams, which incidentally weigh 1 gram or 1 million micrograms. So the EPA standards for PM 2.5 are 15 micrograms per cubic meter annual average and 35 micrograms 24-hour average. Those are very small numbers. That's 35 millionths of a teddygram. So how are we supposed to measure this? Well, classic particulate matter measurements involve drawing mechanically sorted particulate matter in a measured amount of air through a pre-weighed fine filter. And then you measure the weight of that filter after a period of time elapses. This requires very precise scales, likely contracting a lab, and very expensive hardware, but it yields the most accurate results. This method is typically used when regulatory studies are conducted that require the most stringent quality assurance standards. For example, measuring a specific airborne compound in an industrial setting. But besides the steep price, a drawback to gravimetric methods is that they only give a total weight for a given time, such as 24 hours, and allows no insight into what happens at specific points during the sampling period. So some very smart people recognized this problem and developed a real-time measurement technology called laser photometry. The design is similar to gravimetric devices. Pre-sorted particles of a known quality of air are drawn into the instrument for a specified amount of time. But instead of collecting particulates on a paper filter and weighing it, the air is routed into a chamber where beams of laser light are emitted towards a receiving sensor. Particles enter the chamber and interact with laser beam, causing it first to change its intensity because you have this particle that's entering in and blocking part of that light that's measurable. And it's also causing it to scatter, called refraction. So this intensity reduction of the laser light and the angle of its refraction are measured, and a series of calculation estimates the weight of the particles. And voila, we have measured mass concentration of the specific particulate matter of interest at a discrete moment in time. So we can then continuously take these measurements over longer periods to determine a 24-hour or even an annual average. The issue with photometers is that they are relying on visual cues, which can be quite accurate, but fall victim to a central pitfall that's best illustrated by comparing two objects of similar visual quality. Think of two baskets. We've got one containing ping pong balls and another filled with golf balls. From an aesthetic viewpoint, the two are the same size. But knowing what we know about these very two different objects, you and I would not assume that the two baskets would weigh the same, right? But relying on visual cues only, the photometer would make this assumption. Fortunately, we have a way to remedy this. The units that we're using, the TSI Dust Track 2 8530, is designed to address this issue. Users can set a calibration factor, which has been scientifically determined through stringent testing to accurately represent the weights of typical compounds in PM 2.5. Plus, not only does the dust track measure as a real-time laser photometer, it also has this handy little 3.7 millimeter gravimetric filter cassette built in, so the user can further calibrate the meter to match whatever conditions measurements are being taken in. So the EPA has determined that the Dust Track 2 laser photometers operate within an accuracy that's appropriate for this kind of baseline data collection. So there you have it. Now you know how we're able to measure the teeny tiny little grams of particulate matter in the air. So let's move on and talk about study design. It was drafted back in 2018 under the very fair assumption that a regular cruise season would take place during the summer when sampling is conducted. What I'm showing you here is a graph that shows the projected number of passengers and the projected number of cruise ships in the summer season of 2019. So monitoring was set to begin in April, just before the first ship arrives, so we could establish a baseline without the influence of potential sources, and then continue throughout the season to capture data during the height of activity. 3 locations were selected along a southwest-northeast gradient, a strategy that allows us to see whether cruise ship emissions, which originate from the harbor, right down here at the southwest end of the gradient, whether those are more concentrated near the source or if they're distributed more evenly throughout the study area. We're also looking for the best representation of ambient air quality. We want the general air. We don't want specific little pockets of air. We want ambient air quality. And having 3 locations along this gradient offers a better data set than a single location. Site selection is very important when we're considering representativeness. If a monitor is set up in the lee of a building or a tree, air currents and turbulence could skew results. Similarly, if we set up directly by a busy road, say State Street, the monitor will be recording direct emissions from passing vehicles instead of the ambient air. So ideal placement requires a bit of trigonometry, a little bit of ingenuity and compromise, because the world is full of random variables that exist everywhere, and being flexible goes a long way. So our first station, down by the boat launch in the small boat harbor, in an open location far away enough from trees and buildings so turbulence wouldn't be an issue. The site is also within view of the harbor master office, offering an extra set of eyes to ensure the equipment is not messed with. Station 2 is in an open area next to the STC Tribal Community Center, about midway along the Skagway axis. Again, having the advantage of STC staff being able to visually confirm that equipment is secure. And the final station is in an open area at the north end of town in view of the homeowner who keeps tabs on the monitor. This is our favorite unit because of its official name. The dust tracks are owned by STC. They're numbered from north to south, south to north, and they are all particulate observers. Therefore, the north unit is called STC 3PO. If the study had continued into November, we might have dressed up the station appropriately for Halloween. So next year, keep your eyes out. You might see a dressed up little particulate observer up there on 21st. So the dust track unit is known as a desktop model. It can plug into a wall socket and sit on your desk while it collects data from your home or your office or your workspace. But we can also set it up outdoors and run it for extended periods of time with a few add-on accessories. Remember that one of the EPA benchmarks for PM 2.5 is 35 micrograms averaged over 24 hours. This means that to produce meaningful and comparable data, we need a 24-hour test. With the onboard battery system, the dust track can run for about 16 hours. So in order to extend this operating time, we need to add an external battery. You can see that here in this top middle picture. It's our little external battery. Here's the whole bank of them there, ready to go. So we also need protection from the elements, right? Counting on fair weather here is pretty futile. So we employ the use of a waterproof environmental enclosure. Turbulence can occur not only in the lee of a building, but also at the boundary layer of air right along the ground. So we need to keep the inlet of our station above the ground, and we put it at about the level of an average person's head, because that's where our air inlet is located. So we put the enclosure on a leveled surveyor's tripod. So STC staff drafted what is called a Quality Assurance Project Plan. We call it a QAP. And this is to ensure that data collected are gathered in such a way that results are accurate, replicable, legal, and defensible. That's really important. This document is reviewed and approved by the EPA and includes all the pertinent information about study design, data management, equipment calibration, roles and responsibilities, and all the other critical aspects of the project. EPA quality assurance officers negotiated with STC staff on the sampling frequency needed for this baseline study and concluded that a 24-hour test conducted every other day at each location was sufficient enough for good statistical analysis. The QAP also outlines additional environmental data collection protocol, such as temperature, wind speed, and cloud cover, which we gathered to assess meteorological correlations to air quality anomalies. Say that 5 times fast. We wanted to be able to look at a spike in PM 2.5 and see whether there was a simultaneous drop in barometric pressure or an increase in temperature. In this age of data, the more the merrier. So all said, our sampling schedule was set to begin in April and run through the end of September, 6 months. Sampling would occur every other day for a total of 87 sampling events across 3 locations. Protocol outlined in the QAP required about 2 hours of working time every setup for calibration, deployment, collection of environmental variables, and completion of field notes, and just about the same amount of time on breakdown days for packing things up, recording test results and environmental conditions, scheduled maintenance, and data offload. For 6 months, there would be something to do every single day. So everything was all lined up, and it was time to begin final preparations. And this was back in March 2020, and then the pandemic hit. At first, we thought that the study was a wash. When Canada shut down its ports and the cruise season was effectively canceled, our primary goal of assessing the impact of a cruise season on air quality became unattainable. Then the wheels began to spin, and we realized that the perfect real-world controlled experiment was sitting right in front of us. So think about experimental design. Let's say you want to determine if compost tea causes a plant to grow larger than using water alone. You would have 2 groups of plant, control and treatment. All other environmental variables like temperature and light would be kept at a constant, but the control group would receive just plain water and the treatment group would receive compost tea. After a time, you could compare the 2 groups of plants and measure them and see, and if the treatment group was larger, knowing that all other variables were the same, you might conclude that there is sufficient evidence to support the hypothesis that compost tea positively affects plant growth, right? Easy to do in a controlled setting like a lab, but you get out in the real world and this becomes a little more complicated. Skagway's air quality is affected by numerous different variables, but our goal is to evaluate the impacts of tourism on PM 2.5. In a perfect controlled experiment, you would measure air quality in both the presence and absence of a tour season with all its potential sources of PM 2.5. Make no mistake, summer of 2020 was a hard time for a lot of people, but it did offer an unprecedented opportunity to capture the control group for air quality, this snapshot of the baseline community contribution to PM 2.5 that would otherwise be impossible to isolate from the background noise of a typical season. So that's an awful lot of background information, but I'm hoping it helps you all to understand our test results. All in all, we set up air monitoring stations 263 times over 6 months, analyzed more than 1 million liters of air, collected nearly 400,000 individual samples, recorded more than 3,000 environmental observations, and completed around 1,300 calibrations and quality assurance checks. Some of you might have asked how things were going back in June, and now you might understand my bug-eyed expression at the time. We were really, really busy. So all these data were recorded in a field book and then digitized into a spreadsheet. What I'm showing you here is the Excel page for Station 1 at the Small Boat Harbor. And with data in this format, we can mix and match the different columns. These are all different environmental variables, so that we can create graphs that assist in visualizing trends and correlations. So here is a graph that simply shows the 24-hour average concentration of PM2.5 at the Small Boat Harbor for the entirety of the study period, reported in milligrams as opposed to micrograms. So the trick here is just to drop that decimal out of there, and then you're reading in actual micrograms. Here, the red line is that EPA benchmark for a 24-hour average at 35 micrograms. And as you can see, this location remained well below the regulatory limit. And you might be saying, well, yeah, I think most of us were cognizant of how clean the air felt this summer. But remember, our QAP makes these data legal and defensible. So we can confidently report that community contribution to PM2.5 in the summer of 2020 at this location did not exceed the regulatory limit established by the EPA, and we can report by how much. And that's great news, right? And if we look at all three stations simultaneously, we can see that this was the case at all locations from the harbor to 21st. And I took the average of all the 24 averages at each location and came up with a pseudo annual average, which was between 1 and 2 micrograms, well below the EPA benchmark of 15 for an annual average. But take this with a grain of salt, of course, since we only captured half the year. Now let's look back at the chart for STC 3PO, our favorite unit, the north end of town, and we can see a few spikes in PM 2.5. I mean, only one that was really, truly significant, but these ones, what was this on April 29th, May 29th, and July 30th. Remember I said we could combine columns from the field notes to create graphics and see if there are any correlations between PM 2.5 events and environmental variables. So this chart adds a secondary axis depicting wind speed on the Buford scale, which is a common way to estimate wind speed based on visual cues. Those are these red bars, right? What you need to know to interpret this graphic is that wind at a Buford 2 is the first time you feel air movement on your face. It's very calm. A 0 means no air movement at all. And all three of these spikes occurred below a Buford 2, and 2 of them occurred at a Buford 0. Very interesting. However, we have to be careful not to assign causation. We can't say that still air causes PM 2.5 to spike, because there are more than 20 days at a Buford 0 with no elevated aerosols at all. There are likely many other variables, not the least of which is just the simple presence of PM 2.5, which we did not have in spades this summer. But logic tells me that still air will likely harbor aerosols longer than a stiff breeze, and the data do appear to support this notion. Bear in mind also that our observations are acute. We only recorded one moment in time, at the moment of setup. So saying the wind speed and direction on April 29th was a Buford 2 at 20 degrees is not entirely accurate, because the wind changes velocity and direction an infinite number of times on any given day. The only remedy to this is having a dedicated weather station continuously recording conditions at each location, which for now is not practical. So I want to take a look at one more cross-section of our results because it highlights the benefits of photometer monitoring versus gravimetric. We're looking here, you see how we've got these 3 spikes that are all occurring, all 3 locations simultaneously. It's the only spike that really crossed all stations. So on the evening of July 29th, my wife Sarah and I were walking the dog and we noticed this thick haze beginning to set in across the inlet. And the next morning was the setup day where we recorded this little spike. And part of our protocol is to take a few instantaneous readings to make sure that the equipment is operating in a satisfactory range. We recorded PM 2.5 levels over 50 micrograms per cubic meter at all 3 stations, and the visibility was still very poor despite clear skies. Wind speeds at all locations were a Buford 0. However, later in the day, the wind picked up and remained elevated throughout the next day. So if we look at graphs from all 3 stations on July 30th, you can clearly see there's this elevated aerosol early on, all 3 stations, right? And then a reduction of PM 2.5 to nearly 0 in the early afternoon. That's when the wind picked up. So the wind, it looks like, just carried all this stuff away. Our 24-hour averages ended up well below the regulatory limit. However, I suspect that if we'd initiated the test on the evening of the 29th, the average would have been much higher. And with gravimetric sampling, we wouldn't have even seen this event unfolding at all. So there we have it. The summer of 2020 provided us with the results for the control group of our study, and that means that our experiment is really only half completed, and we're already preparing for next summer's round of sampling. Our dust tracks need to be recalibrated by the manufacturer, maintenance supplies have to be acquired, and our crop is currently being updated to include a second or even a third summer. So what else does the future hold? Well, understanding PM 2.5 levels is really only part of the story. Remember that fine particulate matter can be made up of many different compounds, and our monitors only quantify the total concentration and not what the composition is. So fortunately, the National Park Service has been looking at the composition of Skagway's air for a very long time. Many of you may be familiar with their lichen study. Some of you might have actually participated in the lichen study. So permanent arboreal macrolichen plots were set up and sampled for elemental analysis. But also, in partnership with the municipality of Skagway, NPS has collected data on nitrogen and sulfur compounds at Lower Dewey Lake and St. Lee Hill in Dyea, using two different methods. So passive sampling was conducted using ambient atmospheric pollution samplers every 2 weeks over 4 summers. That's this top picture here. These little canisters contain a filter that they're then able to analyze for these nitrogen and sulfur compounds. And then depositional sampling from throughfall, which is the water that filters through the vegetation canopy, was collected using these cool ion exchange resin tube precipitation collector arrays. I want one of these for my house. And they're looking at total deposition from spring until fall. And these two methods were employed during the summers of 2008, 2009, 2018, and 2020. So the Park Service has data for nitrogen and sulfur compounds from both the typical tourist season and the outlier summer of 2020 without cruise ships. This analysis of these data is going to be very informative, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the results. STC and NPS have been discussing collaboration options, and we hope to partner in air quality studies in the future. And another possibility that's being explored is the implementation of a more permanent photometer monitoring network that runs 24/7, using less expensive equipment that can automatically upload the data to the cloud and is then viewable by anyone with an internet connection. These are the purple air monitors, and they operate in much the same way as our TSI dust tracks. They're both light scattering laser photometers, and we're really curious how data from the two units compare. This would be fairly simple to evaluate. The two could simply be co-located, meaning set up side by side. So we'd have a purple air and a dust track set up collecting data on the same ambient air, and we would let them run for a time and then look at whether there are significant discrepancies between the data sets. If it's found that the data are reliably comparable, we could establish a network and we could develop an air quality index along with a warning system that could alert Skagway residents of an air quality event taking place. There's a lot of stuff that we can do for air quality, and I think that the protection of residents is definitely high on the list of priorities. So with that, I think we can open it up for questions. Yeah, feel free to type into the chat, or we've got a small enough group. I think that if you just want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask away, I'm open for any sort of format. Yeah, thanks for sitting and listening to me for 40 minutes.
Hey, Reuben, this is Jason Verhage. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to join in until about 10 minutes ago, but I do see that this is being recorded. Where will this be available in the future?
Yes, that's a great question. So Skagway Traditional Council has a YouTube page, and let me see if I can pull up. I think you just want to log into YouTube and look up Skagway Traditional Council, find our page, and as soon as I process this video, I'll be posting it there. And I will also post this on Facebook and on our website so that we're all able to find this recording.
That's great, thank you.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to say, this is Donna Grifford, that I'm looking forward to seeing the comparison in the future with a cruise ship season.
We are too. We're going to be, yeah, we're very fascinated to see what's actually happening. Another interesting thing that happened this summer, there was a lot of data collection because of how anomalous this summer was. The Department of Environmental Conservation was out sampling water quality in the harbor as well. So I think that there will be some interesting data coming out all across many different disciplines that will be very cool.
Yeah, it's a very unique opportunity. So pandemic did have a few perks for us.
Little bit of a silver lining, certainly.
Yep.
And it looks
Reuben?
like, yeah.
Deb Betcher, can you tell the difference between the pollution from the cruise ships and the train?
That's a very good question. We can't with our data because we're just looking at particulate matter concentrations. So we're not looking at the actual compounds. I'm not a super keen chemist, but I imagine that the train and the cruise ships are both emitting the same kind of, like the nitrogen and the sulfur is probably coming off of that. So I think the Park Service data is going to offer a little more insight into that.
And would you make recommendations for one or the other to somehow clean up their pollution? Should they, let's say, have really high concentrates of particulates?
Certainly, we could make some recommendations. I know that a lot of the cruise ships are using air scrubbers. That's kind of a controversial subject because while it cleans up the air, because that stuff has to go somewhere. What they're finding in a lot of studies is that the air scrubbers, instead of putting these chemicals up into the air, they're putting them into the water because it goes out through their gray water systems. So I think there is certainly very good opportunities to have discussions with the cruise industry, with White Pass, and talk about what we can do if we do find out that there is this elevated amount of air pollution that's coming from these activities. Having a discussion about mitigating that is certainly the next good step.
Hey, Reuben, this is Haley.
Hey.
Hey, I have a question. If you guys, and I was late too, like Jason, sorry, but if you notice a difference from when the ore ships are in.
Good old question, because we had several this summer that came through. And we didn't notice any correlation to any spikes in PM 2.5 and those ore ships being in.
Sorry, I lost the page for a second. Thank you. That's interesting.
Yeah, no problem. What was interesting, again, because these laser photometers allow us to see things in real time, there were certain instances where we could see these very short-term spikes, tugboats running, or even a car passing by. You can see that these things are putting off emissions, but whether or not that affects overall ambient air quality, that's kind of what we're getting to with this study. We want to find out if the general air that we're all breathing is being detrimentally affected overall.
Hello, Reuben.
Hello.
This is Rick. I was just curious, very good information here. And I'm curious to see if you have a gut feel guess or any kind of estimation of what you expect next year. If you assumed, let's assume we're going to have a normal summer, which we probably won't be quite back to normal, but what do you think you're going to see with that? I'm just curious to get your opinion on that.
I couldn't even offer an educated guess on that. This is my first time dealing with air quality stuff. I know that we have inversion events here in Skagway, and it's basically when warm air is trapping cold air further down below. And we see this kind of stratification happening. I think in one of the Park Service photos that I brought up earlier in the presentation, you can see that air kind of gets squished down to a base level. And on days like that, I wouldn't be surprised to see well over the 35 microgram mark. But because we had no cruise ships this year, I have nothing to compare it to. So I'm very interested to see what our first big ship day looks like, especially if we have one of those inversion events.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's going to really be interesting to see if we actually go over that air quality minimum level set here. It'd be very good. It's sure nice that you have this baseline here. That's really helpful.
Definitely. All right, folks, if there's no other questions, I think we can probably let you go and call it a night. I'll be distributing the quiz. Please hand them back to me within, I'm just kidding. There's no quiz. Thanks again, everybody, for coming and sitting through the talk, and definitely keep your eyes peeled for next summer. We'll do the same thing again. Hopefully we'll do it a little earlier in the year. As far as presenting the results, we'll try to keep it a little closer to the early fall. And yeah, thanks again, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Again, please feel free to get in touch with me, and I will get this video up onto YouTube for those of you who joined late, and we'll see you the next time.
Thank you, Reuben.
Thank you. Very
Thanks,
interesting.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Reuben. Good information.
Cheers. And we can just go to